Good afternoon. If I could ask you to please take your seats, and if I could ask the speakers to please come and sit up in the front. Good afternoon. My name is Erwin Chemerinsky, and like Chris Edley before me, I have the privilege of being Dean of Berkeley Law. We're here this afternoon to remember a wonderful person, to mourn his passing, and I think most of all, to celebrate his life. It is a life truly worth celebrating. Chris was a person of enormous talents who made a huge difference in so many ways. He was also a wonderful human being. I first met Chris almost 50 years ago when we were in law school together. Our paths crossed so many times with the opportunity to work on many things together. And I had the great good fortune of being his colleague at Berkeley over the last 7 years. When I think of Chris, one thing that's striking is how unpretentious he was. Even in law school, he was working at the high levels of a political campaign. He served at the high levels of 2 Democratic administrations. He was a professor at Harvard Law School. He created a major civil rights center there. He was the dean of Berkeley Law. He was the interim dean of the School of Education here. And yet, he was one of the least arrogant people I ever met. He had a terrific sense of humor. Sometimes it was self-deprecating humor. Sometimes it was directed at, including the Berkeley bureaucracy. He was fond of referring to California Hall with a certain amount of affection and a certain amount of derision as Moscow Central. Many people wrote me in talking about this memorial and saying it should be filled with laughter. And at first that might seem like an oxymoron in talking about a memorial service, but I know that Chris would want it no other way. Chris was somebody who believed that change could happen and was remarkably effective in making it occur. Others will talk about his impact in government and other spheres. I want to talk about how as dean at Berkeley Law, he truly transformed this institution. When he came to Berkeley, he often said, I can quote, that the physical building was akin to a bus station in a poor country. He was determined to change that. He was told, though, that there was no way to expand the law school outward, so he went underground. He was told there weren't adequate funds, and he convinced the campus to modify its rules to allow mortgage to build the addition that was completed in 2012 that really changed the physical plant. He recognized that the funding of the law school and professional schools in the University of California simply couldn't work. And if we were going to be a terrific law school, there needed to be a different model. He was responsible for creating it. And it's one that stresses scholarships for students. Thanks to Chris Edley, 20% of the law school budget each year goes to student scholarships. Chris created many research centers in the law school. He believed that the law school had to be a force for social change. Centers like the Berkeley Center on Law and Technology, the Berkeley Center on Law and Business, the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, the Henderson Center on Social Justice, and so many more were created under his leadership. Chris was deeply committed to supporting public interest work by students. So he did something that, so far as I know, is unprecedented in the United States. He assured every law student, for after his or first year and after his or second year, a school-funded fellowship to work in public service. For many years now, we've called these the Edley Grants. Chris saw a need to expand the faculty, and he worked hard to hire so many terrific people to the faculty, many of whom are in the audience today. I've had conversations with Maria and their son Chris, but what we can do is a lasting memorial and tribute to the legacy of Chris Edley. And so I'm delighted to announce today that we're immediately creating the Christopher Edley Jr. Center on Law and Democracy. It will study the problems of democracy here and across the world. And most of all, it will work for solutions. It will do cutting-edge research. It will hold programs. It will engage in advocacy. And in everything that it does, it will engage our students, because they, after all, are the leaders of tomorrow who will protect and save our democracy. So, as long as there is a Berkeley Law, for decades and decades into the future, my hope is there will be the Christopher Edley Jr. Center on Law and Democracy. And if it succeeds, as I think it will, in being a tribute to Chris Edley, the one thing that I know for sure is it will make a huge difference. With that, I want to turn the program over to the president of the University of California, a dear friend of Chris's, Michael Drake, and then ask each of the speakers to come up in succession rather than doing introductions. Michael?
Well, thank you very much, Erwin. Good to see you, and good to see so many friends here of the University of California, of the University of California, Berkeley, of the University of California School of Law at Berkeley. So many people that we've known for so many years. My wife, Brenda, an alumnus from 1975, and great to see her, Dean, and many others here in the audience. And nice to see you all. And I was thinking as I walked in, a little bit like the Live Aid concert that happened in 1985. I was on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I should say proudly. But a little bit like the Live Aid concert. I remember watching that concert, and John Lennon wasn't there. And John Lennon was really a part of the movement or the culture or the community. And it was like the one person missing in the formation. So I'm missing Chris, as I know we all are today, because it's a room where instead of some words to say on his behalf, we all would be expecting to be greeted with a hug. And I'm thinking that as I walked in. My comments are straightforward. I met Chris just about 20 years ago when he came to the University of California. He arrived with great fanfare. Wunderton, coming from the east out to the provinces to see if he could inject some culture and spirit. What a great thing. What a great thing for us. And we look forward to his work. And he immediately, upon arriving, not a non-shrinking violent, he became a part of the community broadly and really extended beyond Berkeley and beyond the College of Law to really legal wisdom and higher education guidance in the system. I was working at OP at the time, and Chris became a part of that sphere. He ultimately had an office just down the hall from where the president's office was and worked as a senior advisor on all things law. One of the things that helped me a lot then, having gone soon thereafter to Irvine, is that we were starting law school. And in doing that, we needed to have advice. I needed to have advice. I needed to have someone I could call to say, gee, we're thinking about doing this. It's a blank sheet of paper. What do you think? And Chris was terrific. I would describe, Chris a few years younger than I, but an old soul. and I would reach out to him for wisdom and guidance, alone, on the phone at night. Here's what we're thinking about doing. What do you think? One of the things, actually, I should look to the front row and say one of the things we talked about a lot was bringing in the new dean for the law school at Irvine. And it was really great to get to know Erwin through Chris's eyes in those days. And I'll share with you when I come back to the audience, Erwin, what he said about you. But it was great to do that, and then to work with him in that capacity as well. And then it was also great to work with him, I will say personally, as a colleague and friend, about the same age, growing up in a similar space. We found ourselves sort of on the, if I can describe this, on the crest of a wave. If change in society and civil rights were a bit of a wave, there were some of us who were of age to be able to be kind of on the front of that wave, kind of sailing into places that hadn't been occupied by people like us before. And we hear that today, and I appreciate that when I hear that from people. It was an everyday experience for us of that age. Chris was a friend and colleague of Charles Ogletree, who had been in college with me and with Brenda, and who became my son's advisor when he went to law school later. And it was great to have that generation of us who had kind of come through in the 1970s, now in a position to advise those who were coming through a generation later, thinking of the things that the efforts that we had put out had really created for the future. And in thinking about Chris, and I'm so excited about the Center for the Study of Law and Democracy, such an important thing for our country as we see every day, is that one of the things I would say that was so important to me about what Chris did was he did his work at these very, as I would say to my grandson now, highfalutin levels, working really with the leaders of the country, the leaders of the free world, imparting that wisdom, but imparting a perspective that hadn't been there before, and really, I think, helped illuminate the way forward. By doing that, he was one who was sort of carving a path through uncharted waters for us, but doing it in a way that it created a freeway after him that was well lit for those who would follow. And so in those years, it was dozens and then hundreds and now thousands of people who followed in the pathway that he helped create. And it's so nice that that will continue on into the future. So I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge Chris and the great work that he did. And also, let me say, thank Maria. You know, Maria and I were on a board together, and so I had Chris as my colleague, working through on a daily basis, but then Maria and I would be at the board, and Chris would come as a trailing spouse, and then we were dinner companions, which was actually great fun for all of those years to have those connections in so many ways, and just so sad always to lose any of us, and so sad when it's too soon, but to know the great light that's been created for those to follow, the great pathway that's been created for those to follow. Chris is someone who we will not forget and whose memory and legacy will last.
My name's Kent McGuire, and I've been told I only have 5 minutes. And that's a problem. But I'm gonna see what I can do. I have to start by saying that I'm honored to even have been asked to speak this afternoon. Edley, as I'm mostly referred to him, many of us actually referred to him that way, was pure genius as far as I'm concerned, an intellectual force of nature. And I've been around long enough to know a lot of people, and I can't say that, you know, about so many. But nor do I know anyone with so unwavering a commitment to equity and social justice. I just don't know anyone more committed to that, more committed to bringing the force of research and evidence in addition to the law, all of that, to bear on the work he did and on the issues about which I know everyone in this room agrees. I'm sure many others will trace his unique and remarkable career. I'm just going to travel quickly over the many different times and ways in which I have encountered him. He treated me the same way, regardless of where that was, with a modicum of respect, but not too much. During his time at Harvard, of course, he focused on ed policy and civil rights. He created that center with Gary Orfield. I was at the Lilly Endowment then, and we were trying to make what we thought was a forceful argument in front of then, the governor about a high-stakes test. And we thought this was the right case to make with Governor Bai. Our argument to the governor was, well, if you're not going to give kids an opportunity to learn this stuff, you shouldn't be testing them on the stuff, right? And Gary and Chris ran into the governor at a meeting at the Kennedy School. Now, Chris didn't do this, but I could have blamed him. But Gary walked up to him instead, said, I got this. Governor, you're wrong. And Evan turned around and said, about what? And then he went on to say about this high-stakes test. And I think Chris was patting him on the back, keep going. And Evan Bai comes back to Indiana, has his education policy advisor give me a call. And his pop picked the phone up, says, well, since when is the Lilly Endowment involved in lobbying? And I said, well, I don't have a clue what you're talking about, right? And then he proceeded to tell me this story. And I said, I'm just sure that the center simply trying to help the governor get this right. And that was Edley, got to get this stuff right. Okay, he ends up at the White House in the Clinton administration as special counsel and senior advisor to the president. I'm over in the Department of Education. I've got the research office. I've got NCES under my wing. I'm sure Edley thought he was the one actually running the National Center on Education Statistics. But he played a really big role there, particularly on questions of affirmative action. We're going to so miss his voice on this set of issues now. Really. Years later, I'm already at risk of my 5 minutes. Years later, he would co-chair an equity commission in the Obama administration. I was out of the government by this time, determined never to return. I always thought that would be a heavy lift. But I have a point of view about the sort of frame that was underneath the reform agenda of the administration. It was well intended, as it was. And I just think his experience with the commission, in part, but you can correct me on this, Maria, is what led him to create the Opportunity Institute, where he'd have an opportunity to follow up on the many issues he thought the commission should have driven a hard bargain on. And I just enjoyed talking to Chris when he set that up. I don't think I was ever, in fact, I know I haven't yet been as generous as Chris thought I should be. But I'm not done. But it was so good to talk to him about his agenda for that institute, the unfinished business that he wanted to conduct on the one hand, and the work he was interested and prepared to take out across the states, which I think for Chris was new terrain. But he went into it with his eyes wide open. I enjoyed collaborating with him in the Deep South, in Mississippi, for instance. We worked in Ohio. I can't count all the states where the Institute has set up camp, but it was just interesting to work with him on how to explore that. Where I had the most fun, I'm almost done, however, was on our various National Academies committees. To be on a committee with Chris, and especially a committee that Chris chaired, was just an adventure. Just an adventure. I wrote this down. I got to see if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. These were among the most stimulating expeditions you could be on. He could be stubborn, even difficult, especially if he thought one or more of his members was drifting far off the path that he had set for us to be on. But he could also be amazingly summative and synthetic when he knew that we were struggling to find our way, and that he could sort of give a little ground here, pull a little rope here, and get us organized to agree with him, in the end. That was vintage, penultimate Chris Edley. When I think about the times we're in now, the strong headwinds in our face, the disinclination to agree about the facts, to have large arguments about small things, and even more, the chilling effect that these divisive times are starting to have on so many of us. I can't think of a need for Chris to be here with us now, and I will so dearly miss his intellectual leadership, his humor, but mostly his passion and commitment to all things good and right. So again, just thank you for the opportunity to comment on him.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Selbin. My partner, Laurel Fletcher, and I first want to express our deepest condolences to Maria and Zara and Elias, and to C3 and his beautiful family. Thank you for the incredible honor of getting to share some reflections about Chris. I first heard the name Christopher Edley 38 years ago when I was a 1L at Harvard Law School. Even as a young professor, Chris was already the stuff of legend, in large part because of his serious engagement with the outside world, which you've already heard a lot about and we'll probably hear more about. In fact, I think he was off serving as a policy director for a presidential campaign or something. So I actually never had the opportunity to study with him. But fast forward 15 years when he showed up at Berkeley to completely, as our current dean noted, transform the school. It's really hard to overstate the energy, aspirations, and the people that Chris brought to Berkeley, not least of whom were his incomparable Chief of Staff, Marilyn Byrne, who is here today. Thank you, Marilyn. He also brought with him this child genius, budget chief, Laurent Heller. Anyway, that becomes relevant a little later in the story, but partly because they came from Harvard, Chris and his team couldn't abide the scarcity mindset at Berkeley. But more importantly, Chris thought we were underselling ourselves and the impact we could have outside the university. He repeatedly challenged us, as he put it, to leverage the intellectual capital of Berkeley to help solve the most pressing problems facing California, the nation, indeed the world, he would say. Chris was inspiring. He was motivating. He gave us a clear sense of public purpose. He grew the faculty by a jaw-dropping 40%. Like so many others, I owe my current position to him. And as you've heard, he created a dizzying array of research centers, undertook a major capital campaign, and invested heavily in our clinical and public interest programs. Chris did this all at a time when the state was disinvesting from higher education generally, and especially from the professional schools. While he forcefully made our case to the governor and the legislature, Chris saw the writing on the wall. For a truck driver in the Central Valley, Chris would say, sending tax dollars to professional schools is a hard sell, and they're not wrong. In one of his characteristic turns of phrase, Chris frequently said that we had gone from being a publicly funded law school to a publicly encouraged law school. In response, though, of course, he did something. As Dean Chemerinsky noted, he fundamentally changed our budget model by increasing tuition and other sources of revenue. But this was critical. He also invested heavily on the front end in financial aid so that students had access to Berkeley, and loan forgiveness on the back end so that they had options in terms of employment, including lower paying public interest jobs. It was, to use a word that we just heard, vintage Chris Edley. It was both progressive and deeply pragmatic. Now, vintage Chris Edley could also be cranky Chris Edley. And if you worked with him, you know what I'm talking about. People have already referenced this. I want to say he wasn't interpersonally cranky, at least not to me, quite the opposite. But he was impatient to turn smart ideas into policy, into action, into results. Chris Edley, I came to appreciate, was cranky for justice. To give just a couple of examples, Chris expected people to think big like he did. I remember a meeting with social justice faculty members. It was, I think, the first month of his deanship. And he was underwhelmed, to put it politely, that we hadn't shown up with a grand plan. In the first 5 minutes, to a somewhat stunned group, Chris grumbled, "Why can't you be as organized and ambitious as the business law faculty?" Which hurt a little bit. Chris also thought that incrementalism was for suckers. When I was still involved in the East Bay Community Law Center, we were negotiating with Chris about renewing the school's financial support. Again, he was not impressed with our proposal. This falls between the chairs, he said. I didn't know what that meant, but I had a pretty good idea the way he said it. You should be asking me for a lot more money to have a much greater impact. People have already spoken about how he loathed bureaucracy, especially, though not all bureaucracy, for those of you in the room who are part of the distinguished guests in the room who are part of the bureaucracy. He loathed bureaucracy that stood in the way of progress. He did everything he could to help us cut through the red tape so that we could spend our time and resources on things that mattered. So Chris was right, of course, on all these points, and he made us better at what we did for the students, for the profession, and for society. In retrospect, and I hope this is okay to share here, I think at least part of Chris's sense of urgency was because he didn't expect to live that long. As many of you know, Chris was treated for a childhood illness that made him medically vulnerable. And in the face of a lot of recent health scares, he talked a lot about dying. We always poo-pooed it, but during the last long conversation that we had with Chris, he was unusually focused on the topic. He had recently attended a memorial service for someone he really revered, and he worried whether people would gather after he died, what they would say, how he would be remembered. I know this is this is only one of several events in Chris's memory, but I think it's why I feel so grateful to be here with all of you celebrating his life today. And so to our beloved Dean, Christopher Fairfield Edley Jr., wherever you are, I want you to know that I see a room full of people from across the vast intellectual and institutional spaces that you inhabited and so deeply influenced, and who are a testament to the indelible and enduring mark you made in this world and on our lives. Your memory is already a blessing. Thank you.
Cranky for justice. We should get a bumper sticker. I'm Linda Darling Hammond. I cannot conjure with Chris being gone, and I do happen to believe there is a world beyond this one, and he is here with us today. So I will talk about him as I think about him, each day in the present tense, not absent, but simply not visible to all of us all of the time. In my mind's eye, I always see Chris smiling, that smile we all know that lights up the room and gives joy to everyone around him. Smiling and tapping while listening to great jazz at Yoshi's. Smiling as he mischievously raises a tough question at a policy seminar or conference, a little hand grenade he would throw into the room. Smiling as he brings people together through his many roles at the Opportunity Institute, and the federal government, at Berkeley Law, and at the Berkeley Education School. Smiling while dining on our patio with Maria and my husband Alan, and sometimes Kent and Yvonne, and others of our mutual friends, talking about our kids and our grandkids, and always the work of making schools work well for all children. Smiling from ear to ear when Obama, one of his own students, was elected president, and we went to work on his transition team together. As I watched the Democratic Convention last week, I could see Chris smiling especially broadly. He is, I am quite certain, so happy right now to see the turn that the political wheel is taking, with Kamala, like Chris, a protector and defender of the people, running for president. The values expressed at the convention, decency, character, compassion, fairness, equity, protection of the weak and vulnerable, concern for and love of others, these are the values that Chris spent his life undertaking and working for and living for. I see him smiling and dancing and probably working the polls in heaven over the coming weeks. They say in Chicago, vote early and often. There are many lawyers who will be fighting the battles for voting rights and integrity that will no longer surround this election, perhaps far into November or December, and I think Chris will be sitting on the shoulders of many of them, whispering in their ears. Chris loved the law. He not only loved the grandeur and the justice-seeking aspects of constitutional law, he loved the underappreciated, not very sexy field of administrative law, which he taught for many years. I admit that when I first heard him wax eloquent about the virtues of administrative law and regulatory design, I thought, what? Really? But he persuaded me that this is where the rubber meets the road, and to solve social problems, this kind of insight is essential. And as you've already heard, Chris saw social problem solving as the critical mission for the law. He wrote a piece in 2012 in the California Law Review on the evolving purposes and ideals of the great American public law school, in which he suggested that the century's great American law school should do more than prepare advocates and litigators. He argued it should train societal problem solvers and the subject and purposes of law are as broad as the affairs of humanity. As Jeff was just saying, it really was his vision. He quoted in this article Dean Jones from a century earlier on the point that to practice law is by its very nature to reform it. Law is a living principle, even as medicine is an advancing science. Law is in process of constant becoming. It is ever being recreated. To this, Edley added that a great public school of law must not be merely an echo of what the law is, but a clarion herald and an agent of progress. And that's really what he set about to establish here at Berkeley. He argued there's a distinctive responsibility in public law schools to engage a portfolio of the most difficult and important problems of society with an intentionality and collective effort that I consider essential to its public character. This contrasts, he said, with the typically laissez-faire ethos of elite private institutions or the civic leadership expected of wealthy institutions. I will note that despite his Harvard origins, Chris regularly teased me for working at Stanford University rather than a great public university, and he had a point. Chris added, to fulfill its problem-solving mission, the great law school must forge strong alliances with other professions and disciplines, something he himself did regularly within the university and beyond in his work as a public service. The law school at Berkeley has always been a great institution. Chris contributed, as you've heard, in enormous ways to becoming greater still at a very difficult time when the state was imposing budget cuts. This was true not only on the outside, but on the inside of the school. Chris persuaded my son Sean, who had been admitted to Harvard and Berkeley, to come to Berkeley, something only a former Harvard man might be able to do, describing the kinds of commitments and opportunities only available in a great public law school, and it was actually really true. The school was truly tackling social problems, not only in the world and the local community. Sean became the coordinator of the Berkeley High School Restorative Justice Program, which many law school students at Berkeley have done and which set his path for the future, but also engaged in internal improvement. When Sean did a survey and an interview inside the school of what distinguished those professors who were able to most connect with and support marginalized students, Dean Edley made sure it became part of the pedagogical conversations of the faculty at meetings and retreats to strengthen justice within its walls, as well as without. I know that he is thrilled that Sean is now an assistant professor at the University of California at Berkeley in the School of Public Health. Chris and I worked together on education policy of many kinds, and he helped set a new, critically important policy agenda when he led, as you've heard, during the Obama administration, the National Commission on Education Equity and Excellence, in which I joined him. The commission set out a sweeping blueprint for achieving educational equity, from school funding reforms to investments in competent and culturally responsive educators to redesigns of schools themselves so that they could support genuine equity. As Chris noted, the persistence of multi-generational poverty is the most villainous explanation for these continuing disparities, with structural racism as its regular sidekick. Accordingly, the commission argued for a new approach to educational equity, a set of wide-ranging social supports for children orchestrated by schools to create a personalized, whole-child approach to schooling to replace the deeply flawed factory model design created for schools a century ago, under which we still struggle and children and educators still struggle in too many places. We worked in recent years in collaboration with his brilliant and beautiful wife, Maria Esteveste, to continue this quest for inventing community schools that wrap around children and families to meet their needs. Because of these efforts, the federal government has quintupled its support for community schools, and California has invested over $4 billion to create 2,000 community schools that are at this very moment connecting families and community organizations to schools, supporting health, mental health, reducing absenteeism, boosting achievement, engaging in social emotional learning and restorative practices, making school a place that is supportive and joyful for all children. This is quintessentially Chris. Solving major societal problems on all of the professions, with all the professions and disciplines coming together, needing to address children's needs. creating and actually activating the village that is needed to raise our children. So I just want to thank Dean Edley. I know you are smiling every time a child has a better day because that village is there for them. And Chris could not have done all of this without Maria, who supported him in every way, organizationally, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, and through the many physical battles he had to face. So thank you, Maria. Thank you to all the family. We offer you our appreciation and love for sharing Chris with all of us.
Good afternoon. I'm Michelle Young, and I'm the Dean of the Berkeley School of Education. And I truly appreciate the invitation to speak with you all today and represent the Berkeley School of Education, our students and our faculty and our staff. It's truly an honor to be here. Chris was more than just a colleague to many of those in the School of Education. He was a relentless advocate for civil rights and a champion of education. And to the broader national conversations on civil rights and education, his contributions are indelible. Chris served as the interim dean of the Berkeley School of Education from 2021 to 2023. And he joined our community after an already illustrious career, as you've already heard. But his appointment marked the first time that someone from outside the traditional field of education had been a dean within our school. Though Chris's experience, as you've heard, supporting educational initiatives like the Civil Rights Project was significant. Chris embraced the opportunity to lead our school with the grace, intellect, and passion that defined his life. Chris consistently reminded our faculty, students, and staff of the essential role of education and nurturing democracy. In fact, he coined our motto, "Educate like democracy depends on it." Those words, which are central to our school's ethos, capture the urgency and the importance of the work we do. A reflection of Chris's profound understanding of educational inequities. Chris spent his time with us working to build and support a faculty and a school that was creative and innovative and diverse. Under Chris's leadership, the school underwent a transformation, including a significant rebranding to the Berkeley School of Education, an evolution that reflected our widening mandate to provide not just graduate, but also undergraduate education. He also established the Berkeley Children's Forum and laid the groundwork for Berkeley Excel, which is a pioneering hub for early childhood research and development, a legacy that will stand as a testament to his vision and commitment. I asked some of Chris's colleagues in our school to share their thoughts about him, and their words capture much better than I his kindness and his humor, his leadership, and his impact. They shared, "He was amazingly brave. He modeled a healthy disrespect for the nonsensical rules that bureaucracies are famous for. He cared deeply for Berkeley, both the idea of the institution and the people who work here. He had an incisive mind and was always eager to hear the evidence backing your argument. He was gentle and caring in a fatherly way. Once, when I asked his blessing via email to take on a campus role, he immediately telephoned me, and he gave me his blessing, but he also gave me advice on how not to be exploited. He was a breath of fresh air, and when it came to bold ideas and thinking outside of the box, he was amazing. He was magical, charming, funny, and passionately devoted to issues of civil rights. He had a great sense of humor, a timely quip, and a strong sense of the absurd. I embraced his honesty, his willingness to care, to listen, to mull over the multitudes. That is what made him a sensational leader, a profound thinker, and a person of integrity and light. These, of course, are only a few of the many tributes that were submitted, but each one attests to the fact that Chris was remarkable in every sense. We will miss him dearly. He has left a lasting impact on our school, and his legacy lives on in the work that we do every day, the students that we educate, and the commitment that we uphold to justice, equality, and democracy. So thank you, Chris, for everything. We will strive to honor your memory by continuing the work that you held so dear. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Tino and I met Chris before we actually met each other, and we were inspired by Chris's example and challenged by his call to help our world live up to its ideals. And his gifts to each of us stretched across decades and live on in everything we do to this day.
Chris could be kind-hearted and patient, but he could also be feisty, and if the argument was about smoothing of fiscal funding for education, fierce. Some of his greatest efforts were behind the scenes, poring like the ad law nerd that he was over budgets, regulations, guidance documents. But his legacies are giant, not just for the world, but for Lucy and me.
So I first learned who Chris Edley was as a sophomore in college. He was the policy director for the Dukakis 1988 presidential campaign, and I was a lowly organizer of college chapters for Dukakis, trying to organize them all over the country. And I didn't have a chance to meet him then, but I became very familiar with his background, and I knew that when I grew up, I wanted to be like him and have a career like him. So you can only imagine my excitement when a few years later I actually got the chance to work with him. During my first semester of law school, though, I was one of 11 pro se plaintiffs who sued Harvard for faculty hiring discrimination at the law school on the basis of race, gender, disability, and sexual orientation. As you might imagine, this and my other activism at school did not endear me to the faculty or to the administration, but Chris gave me a chance anyway, and he hired me as his research assistant. And I personally thought his research was the most interesting anyway. He wanted me to research comparative affirmative action in Malaysia and Nigeria. We actually shared an interest in Nigeria. In college, I had gone to Borno State and done research on female education there for over 4 months. And as you may know, that is the site of where Boko Haram has abducted hundreds and hundreds of girls because they desire an education. So after graduation from law school, I worked for Senator Ted Kennedy on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and it was unusual to go directly to Capitol Hill from the law school, but Chris was really supportive, and he was really excited for me, and he really encouraged me to do it, even though it was not the sort of traditional path at the time. When I got to DC, Chris was already working at the White House, and he invited me to the White House for lunch at the White House mess. I had never been to the White House before, so I was completely starstruck. And when I asked him how he was enjoying his job, he said the job is great, but everyone seems to be a former real estate agent from Little Rock. Eventually, that's true, Chris, isn't it? You can imagine him saying that. Eventually, I joined the Clinton administration at the Justice Department, where I had a chance to meet Maria once. She probably may not remember it, but you have to remember that 30 years ago, there was so much less diversity in DC working these policy jobs, and I was really starstruck by Maria. She was a badass woman of color who was really pivotal in the Clinton administration. And to be honest, I kind of like tried to learn everything about her. I didn't stalk her, but you know, once you see a hero, you want to know like everything about them. Anyway, I regret that I actually never shared this with Maria, and I regret I never shared it when Chris was still with us. So that is my regret. But anyway, for years afterwards, I kept the White House mess gave you this little presidential box of mini M&Ms as a souvenir, and I kept that for forever. I'm surprised that no cockroach or mouse got to it before me. But I also kept my admiration for Chris and Maria and eventually my friendship with them. And having dinner with them was like a brain triathlon because they wanted to think about how to change the world for the better on every plane, at every moment. And they really stretched and challenged me to think harder and to do more to improve the life of others. So fast forward to 2021, when I asked Chris for a recommendation letter in support of my Ninth Circuit nomination. He agreed, but he asked me to give him a rough draft. Because my previous Ninth Circuit nomination had died after the 2016 election, I pulled out all the stops. And this draft was filled with superlatives. And in it, I explained that I leapt tall buildings, that I was about to cure cancer, and we can say it was slightly divorced from reality. Chris kindly brought the letter back down to earth and explained that the buildings were just a few stories tall. You know, I actually love Harvard Law School, but it has a massive student body, and I, at times, felt quite atomized amidst all the hustle and the bustle at such a big school. And Chris made me feel seen, and he made me feel heard. And he made me feel like I mattered. And he kept on doing so as the years turned into decades. And with Chris, I felt that someone really cared, and that was someone that I had greatly admired and had really wanted to emulate in my own career. So to me, Chris was someone who kept rooting for me even as I improbably went from a pro se plaintiff to a judge presiding over a courtroom, and someone who's still rooting for me and all of us today. So I miss him greatly.
Next time my wife and I have to speak together, I'm going to make sure I speak first. It was a gray afternoon in New Haven, Connecticut, some years before I met Lucy, about 5 years, give or take, when I was a third-year law student, and I got a call from Chris Edley. And it took me a minute to process and recognize this was the Chris Edley, Issues Director for the Dukakis campaign some years earlier, rock star Harvard Law professor, the person who ran the part of OMB that was most interesting. And why was he reaching out to me? Well, because he'd heard about me from a mutual friend, Zab Briggs, and he called to talk a little bit about the work he was doing with Gary Orfield. He said, I don't know when we'll get the chance to work together, but I hope that we do. I just want to get to know you. I want to tell you what we're working on. You know, what are we about, Gary Orfield and I? We're working on a project that's sort of about why don't we do better? Why is America not able to solve the problems that it says it cares about? And year after year, why do we keep on coming short? What are the barriers? What are the roadblocks? What are the technical pieces? Where does politics fall short? What's the role of law? What's the role of advocacy movements? And I was starstruck, a word you've heard before, and felt quite warm and excited at getting that call. And the call ended on a hopeful note about the future. There was no action item, there was no to-do list, but there was in my mind this impression of a person that I had admired from a distance who had taken the time and energy to reach out to me, just a third-year law student. It will not surprise you, having heard that a few years later, when I was just getting to know the woman who would then become my wife someday, who's right here, by the way, just to make sure that's clear, we started getting to know each other, and at one point she said, you know, I went to Harvard Law School, and I worked for this professor named Christopher Edley. She had me at, I worked for Christopher Edley. That was the most romantic moment of the evening. A few years after Lucy and I were married, we were very excited. We felt ripples of excitement to hear that he and Maria were going to move to the Bay Area. Chris had this vision that was so invigorating that all of us who were in legal academia wanted to work for Chris and with Chris and be here. He talked about the centers and institutes he was going to create. He talked about the way faculty were going to work together. He talked about the partnerships he was going to create with the School of Education. And I certainly found myself wishing the Dumbarton Bridge did not divide both sides of the bay. How he sketched out the future of the law school, how he used to sort of paint with words and with his hands moving, struck me as tremendously inspiring. Being the administrative law nerd that he was, we developed our own special sense of humor pretty much every time we saw each other. We had some little joke about some judicial opinion or some doctrine. So as I think about what Chris would say today, I'm struck by the fact that if he were here, he would point out that on the year that the Chevron doctrine has been interred, we are meeting in Chevron Auditorium. And the sense of the absurd would come to the fore. Now it's 2008, and I'm sitting in my office preparing to teach another semester of administrative law, and the phone rings, and it's Chris Edley again. And now he's asking me to be part of a small effort to help the potential incoming administration prepare for taking office if it wins the election. So this is the Obama-Biden transition just getting started at the very beginning. And his words were focused on budgets and personnel and plans for the first few months. But what I remember was his tone. His tone said, this can happen, and we have to be ready. And I believe in you, and I trust you. And that's what really stuck with me. He could get into the weeds and then zoom out to 30,000 feet. As the transition was gathering speed and people spent more and more time asking where in the org chart they would go, Chris stayed focused on what mattered most. What were the roadblocks going to be? What is stopping us from achieving what matters most? Crucially also, awkward conversations, sometimes it would create long pauses during the transition committee meetings that we were part of, that were all about what accountability really meant, what it could mean, what it should mean, and looking at past administrations, what we might do to make that accountability matter. Just a few weeks later, I was working at the White House, and not a week would go by that I didn't think about how that improbable fact depended so much on a pair of phone calls that I'd gotten from Chris Edley. So there I was working on democracy, immigration, civil rights. These were words that were filled with specific meaning for Chris. And to each subject, he brought the scalpel of his mind. But no subject made him more passionately engaged than education, and how education had this weird dual quality. It was both a gateway, a pathway to opportunity and progress, but also the way we sorted people's opportunities out and closed doors to some folks. So it was my great privilege and pleasure to join Linda Darling-Hammond on the Equity and Excellence Commission to work with Chris. Improbably enough, I ended up being his co-chair, which meant being his sidekick. Of course, as you would expect, he was charming. He used all his skills and warmth to keep the process going when we found roadblocks that divided the school choice advocates on the one hand, union presidents on the other hand. He was the most learned, he was patient, and he was diplomatic when he could be, weaving together a narrative that was about how money did matter in K-12 education, even if it wasn't the only thing that mattered. How it also mattered to know how the money was going to be spent, and how it mattered just as much to know whether it was working. I said he was patient and diplomatic when he could be. He was also intensely devoted to the substance, to the young children that, as he used to say, were too small to fail, to making sure that no child left behind, the law got left behind and replaced by something better, to making sure we didn't end up with the thin gruel of platitudes in the push to have the compromises that we needed. Woe be it if someone was too fond of platitudes. If one of us wasn't living up to our potential, Chris would let us know. Once, in the basement of the LBJ building, as we gathered for an ethics briefing from a lawyer from the education department, the lawyer began to explain that fundamentally all ethical questions in these government commissions can be reduced to one simple principle, which is don't switch sides. And all the details didn't matter. When he said that, I saw Chris going like this. At that point, I thought I would want to call the FBI and try to get the witness protection program ready for this lawyer. But I didn't have enough time. Chris said, did you just say the details don't matter? Did I hear that right? And about 10 minutes later, the lawyer, I think, was ready for a career change. Once, I mused out loud to Chris about whether this discussion we've been having on and off that he seemed to be quite interested in about fiscal smoothing, about making sure that the federal government's education spending dollars could be perhaps forward provided to states so that they could keep on spending in a recession. I wonder a little bit if that was too in the weeds and we didn't need to go there. And I remember pretty clearly Chris's response. It was something along the lines of, I love you, Tino, but don't make me resign over this issue of high principle. When it came time to roll out the report, the comms team from education explained that this seemed like a straightforward thing we could do at the National Press Club with a short little dog and pony show. Chris was having none of it. It was either we were going to have the Secretary of Education, the Domestic Policy Advisor, or nothing. We got the Secretary of Education. Generous bluntness, time and again, was how Chris got things done, with warmth, with charisma, but clarity. In the years that followed, Chris and his incomparable Maria remained close to Lucy and me, bestowing the gift of their friendship, inspiring us in our own relationship, encouraging me to join the Supreme Court of California when the time came, reflecting on philanthropy and policy, energizing us with ideas. What stands out? Well, what stands out in all the years I've known Chris, his lightning-sharp mind, his quick wit, his generous spirit and kindness, his devotion to Maria and his family, his sense of the historical arc that somehow wove together the story of post-war America and 21st century America. But most of all, what stands out about Chris was his unique ability to be dissatisfied with our world as it was and replete with a sense of idealism and possibility about what it could become. Always that question, why can't we do better? Why are we satisfied? To many of us, his greatest gift then was not just the example he provided, because he's hard to live up to, but the inspiration, a reminder that in difficult days for our civic life, he's still watching us, sometimes soothing our disappointment, sometimes cracking a joke about Chevron, always insisting on the needs of the kids too little to fail. That being happy warrior, he will remind us, is what perfecting democracy is all about, and that fiscal smoothing isn't the only thing that's non-negotiable. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of the speakers, these FOCs, friends of Chris, who have shared so many wonderful memories of someone whom we all loved so much. And many, many thanks to Maria, C3, Zara, and Elias for sharing Chris with us for so many years, and for today convening this space for us to share our memories with them. My name is Melissa Murray. Chris hired me at Berkeley in 2006 as an assistant professor. And when he did, he not only changed my life, he changed my husband's life, made our California dream that we didn't even know we had possible. I came to Berkeley on January 25th, 2006 for a job interview. I say it was an interview, but the truth of it was I did more listening than talking, because Chris Edley was utterly transfixing. At that point, I had interviewed with probably 10 or 11 law schools. And at each of those law schools, most of the time, the deans had focused on explaining the tenure requirements or course relief or what course packages might look like. When I asked those questions of Chris, he didn't have time for those pesky particularities. He waved away my questions. You'll have whatever research support you need. That was true. You can teach whatever you want. That was not true. I did teach criminal law against my will for many years. The point of it, though, was that to him, those details were just that. They were details. What he really wanted to know of every prospective faculty member whom he interviewed was whether they could thrive at the Berkeley he was building. A law school that, to my mind, upon reflection, was the kind of law school that someone like Charles Hamilton Houston was building at Howard in the 1930s. A law school that not only trained great lawyers, but trained social engineers who understood the law as a laboratory for solving the most intractable problems in society, and indeed the world. As Chris explained, Berkeley had a specific mission to take on that role. It was different from other law schools because it was a public school. It had a responsibility, a mission, to not only be an engine of social mobility, but also an engine of social uplift. And Chris believed completely in the transformative potential of public education and Berkeley. And even though he had been raised in private institutions like Swarthmore College and Harvard Law School, he put his faith in public institutions to absolutely change the world. And as Jeff said, he didn't believe that public education had to be defined by conditions of scarcity or want. Rather, he insisted that it must be empowered by the promise and possibility of being of the public. And that meant prioritizing public interest work. That meant ensuring access and equity for everyone. And that meant building a law school whose mission was guided by an ethos of public engagement and discourse. By the end of our 1 hour meeting, it probably wasn't an hour, he never had an hour, I was completely sold. In truth, I probably didn't even know what I was buying, but I wanted to work for Chris Edley. I wanted to be a part of whatever it was he was building. And so when I joined the faculty in 2006, I became part of a growing cohort of faculty that had been similarly persuaded by Chris's expansive vision of a truly public law school. And not only was Chris transforming what it meant to be a public law school, he was literally transforming the faculty and what it meant to be a faculty member here at Berkeley. During his tenure, the faculty grew substantially. It became younger. It became more diverse and representative of the communities it served. In 2014, Chris and I teamed up for the public interest auction, where we decided to host a chocolate tasting that would be provided by friends of Chris and Maria, the house of Casa de Chocolates on Ashby Street. What should we call it? I said. Chris paused. Chocolate tasting with Edley and Murray. I'm like, no, doesn't have a zing to it. How about chocolate tasting with chocolate professors? He paused, mulling it over in his mind. It's edgy. But you know what would make it better? I'm listening, I said. Chocolate tasting with chocolate professors and special guest Ward Connerly. In addition to diversifying the faculty, Chris started research centers that bridged the gap between theory and policy. He insisted that our scholarship have a purpose beyond the pages of law reviews. He said that we had to understand ourselves not simply as scholars in the monastic sense, the traditional sense, but as scholars whose work went beyond the ivory tower to engage policymakers, decision makers, and ultimately the public. In all of this, he was an extraordinarily visionary leader, generous and engaged, and truly, truly open-hearted. Now, that is not to say he was not without faults. He could be irascible and cranky and impatient. He was impatient with the slowness of change. He was impatient with the mediocrity of small ideas. He was impatient with a campus bureaucracy that he summed up lovingly in one word: Soviet. Some would say that these qualities were flaws, but I think they were just the flip side of what made Chris so great. The flip side of his broad ambition for himself and the institutions for which he worked. The flip side of his unrelenting faith in law and government as forces for good. The flip side of his impulse to always move forward, to move fast, and possibly to break things. Things that maybe should be broken so that we together might imagine something bigger and better to replace it. What I've said about Chris echoes so much of what those who came before me have said, because that was truly the essence of Chris. But to close, let me offer a different slant, another observation about what made Chris such a great man and such an inspiring leader. Because it is not often that those with the talent for sweeping vision can slow down enough to actually make personal connections with people. But Chris had the rare talent of being here, but also being here. Chris once commented that there were 3 things that genuinely surprised him when he came to Berkeley in 2004. The first was that Berkeley was spelled with 3 E's. Who knew? The second was how little public support the campus received from the state, and this would be an ongoing leitmotif throughout his tenure as dean. The third, though, was more surprising: how thoroughly he enjoyed the pastoral aspects of the decanal role. Because Chris truly relished being the paterfamilias of Berkeley Law. When one of us married or had children, he celebrated joyously with us, often commenting publicly, to our chagrin, that not only was the faculty productive, it was reproductive. And when things were hard, as they inevitably were, when colleagues experienced health challenges, were hospitalized, Chris was right there with their families, keeping vigil. And I will never forget a conversation that I had with Chris in March of 2016. It was just 3 days before the campus announced my appointment as interim dean of the law school. I was at home at my desk, and the phone rang. I picked it up, and it was Chris. And his voice had an edge of urgency that I'd never heard from him before. He'd heard through the campus grapevine about my imminent appointment, and he was concerned. "Melissa, are you sure you can do this?" And I was slightly taken aback. This was my mentor, and here he was expressing doubt. Could I do this job? But then he stopped. He said, "No, I don't mean it like that. I know you can do the job. You can keep the law school running. I know you can do that. But that's not the job, Melissa. The job is bigger than keeping the trains running on time. The biggest part, the most important part of this job, Melissa, is that you have to love them all. You have to get up every single day prepared to put them first, to champion them every single day. Are you sure you can do that?" It was the first time I'd ever heard anyone characterize the decanal role in quite that way, and it did give me pause. Could I do that? But as I paused, he continued. And this time, his tone was gentler and less urgent. "That's the job. That's the whole job. Everything else is meaningless. You have to love them all. And Melissa, it can be hard, because sometimes they're assholes." I took the job, and every day I tried to love them all. But I never forgot his wise counsel, because he was right. That was the job. And I knew it because I saw him live that creed every single day of his deanship and in all the days that followed. He loved this law school. He loved the community that he and Maria built here. It wounded him deeply when people moved on. because he believed wholeheartedly that we were all engaged in a collective enterprise to use the law to build a better society, a more just society, a better world. And that was an all-hands-on-deck prospect. This is all to say that Chris Edley was an East Coaster by birth, but I have never met anyone who better embodied the optimism, warmth, promise, and possibility of California. Chris was a California dreamer to his core, and he gave so many of us a California dream we never knew we had. And when I hear that in his last days, Chris worried that he might not be remembered, that he didn't have a legacy that we would all treasure, that actually hurts me so deeply, because this was a man whose legacy was legion, a man who cast such a broad shadow. I'm not sure anyone could ever fill his shoes as completely. To worry that he wouldn't be remembered, Chris, how could we ever forget? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Zara Edley Chaveste. If you don't know, I'm Christopher and Maria's daughter. I first wanted to start off by saying thank you. Thank you for the many people who have reached out, sharing stories and memories of my dad. Through those simple acts and through those memories of others, I have gotten to learn more about my dad. Showing the simple and easy gestures my dad did that changed many people's lives, including my own. To my dad, I'm going to miss the nickname you called me, Cupcake. I'm going to miss the one-liners you had for me and Elias, like as we went off to school, always stopping to say, learn something. I'm going to miss the intelligent, warm-hearted, funny, and goofy man that you were, as well as stubborn. There are still many things I wish I could say and learn from you, many new experiences I wish I could share, many apologies, many wishes, many upsets. But the one thing I wish I could still say is I love you and miss you, your daughter. Thank you.
This is my final eulogy. At my father's homegoing, I used an ancient Christian named Tertullian. And the Son of God died. It is utterly credible because it is unfitting. And he was buried and rose again. It is certain because it is impossible. And then I did Kierkegaard and got to Camus and the Boulder. It was about faith, sort of. My father did not suffer fools, the small-minded, or unfinished ideas. My father lived with a terror of dealing with other people, of fools, but it was a terror that must be overcome because people are so good. We don't need hope because it is the truth. At his DC memorial, I tried to be less abstract and less emotional. In the Clinton archives, I found a 1997 email that he'd written to Sylvia Matthews Burwell, Michael Waldman, and Elena Kagan with this exemplary introduction. I want to be constructive, clear, and concise, not off-putting. Don't know if what follows meets that test, but I'd like to help. So I started with that and laid out an argument or impression that my father was driven by a highly demanding rule of compassion, that compassion was his one natural law in the phenomenological sense, not the jurisprudential. Compassion informed by experience, evidence, and intellect, the argument went, indicates pragmatism, more or less. And then I wrestled that into something about democracy being our greatest lever to build a society based on compassion, realizing the American promise, etc., basically so that Maria and I could introduce the new Center on Law and Democracy. 2 eulogies, hard to write, but easy, if you know what I mean, sort of natural. For today, I was stumped, and I questioned why I wanted to speak. I can be with him without bothering all of you standing where he should be standing. I could talk about that. And then I thought, that's not very interesting to think about. What kind of father, even after he's dead, demands that you make 3 points? And that's the 3rd point. We have to do more. You want to be done grieving, but there is more to do. You want the answer, but you find more questions, and the puzzle has no edges, and it's not even flat. Research and evidence, point 1, demand practice and policy, point 2, and then points 3 through 11, you have to advocate, implement, evaluate, correct, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is a public institution strictly dedicated to doing the public good. This is where it isn't absurd, it is required that we believe bigger ideas and do bigger things, do more good for more people. And so my father was happiest here. Berkeley was the brilliant conclusion to his argument, his 3rd point after Harvard and Washington. So eulogy 3, point number 4. My father was planning his final years, his own 4th point. But he left all of us to figure it out for him. Call it his last act of delegation. Our family is tremendously excited and grateful thinking about the Center for Law and Democracy. It ties together so many threads of his work, and we believe that it will do great things for Berkeley and for the world. So help, please, if you can. But I also want to say that he would not care how or what we do for the public good, what field or discipline we use. He was proudly agnostic, only that we do the most of it that we can to our greatest potential. I have the utmost respect for you all, his friends and colleagues, and the deepest gratitude for your sharing in my father's memory and in his life. And I would only ask that we be even more demanding of one another, with a lot of love and compassion and humor, now that he is gone. So, thank you all. I am told to say that there's a reception, Steinert, at the law school. Law school, Steinert Courtyard. And we should all go think about stuff and talk about stuff together. Thanks.